All right. Well, it's 11, as when we said we'd get started. I'm sure some more people will be logging in, but we'll get started. I'm Chris Van Buren, partner at KMRD, and I head up our employee benefits practice. Thanks for joining us today in our discussion about the ever-changing nature of where employees are working and the issues that come along with that. And then some tips on how to best deal with these challenges. Few logistics as we get started. All attendees are on mute. They are able to enter questions in the Q&A feature, but everyone's on mute, so I think we'll mostly avoid dogs barking or the really heavy typer on the keyboard, which I have to admit that's often been me sometimes if I don't put mute. But and this is being recorded, so you'll be able to rewatch it or share it as much as you'd like. And so what we're going to do today, we'll have brief introductions for the panelists. And then we will get into trends, really trends, challenges that organizations, employees are facing. And then we'll kind of turn the discussion towards really some of the solutions, tips, things that will help handle these issues. Because as we've all seen, and as this team here, as we were discussing on prep calls, this is changing fast. So finding things that can help you deal with it will be better. And then we'll have time at the end for Q&A. So with that, joining us, we have Marcia Zaruba O'Connor. She's the CEO and founder of the O'Connor Group. Since 2007, they've provided outsourced human resources and talent acquisition solutions and have over 75 employees in King of Prussia, Raleigh, North Carolina, and soon Tampa, Florida. Marcia loves helping entrepreneurs, and this year, she's rolling out a new initiative specifically geared to startup female entrepreneurs called Shadow Her. Brian is a director in Kreischer Miller's Tax Strategies Group. He has a wide range of experience providing domestic and international tax planning and compliance services to middle market companies and entrepreneurial businesses in industries including manufacturing, distribution, media, real estate, financial, and professional services. He's also assisted companies with business transactions, including mergers, acquisitions, and transition. And Ingrid is a colleague of mine here at KMRD. Her practice as a risk manager focuses on identifying and developing a plan to manage an organization risks. In addition to having an expertise in educational institutions and manufacturers, Ingrid heads up our international practice and is particularly good at helping companies that have business interests overseas or foreign businesses with US locations. So, hope I didn't miss anything. But we are very happy to have everyone here. I know we're all busy, but Brian in his field is particularly busy. So thanks for everybody making some time. Appreciate it. And with that, just wanted to get into, we're going to kick off with trends. And we really want to hear from the panelists just right now what you're seeing out there. As we've talked about, things are changing. So Brian, if you want to kind of kick us off with sort of some of the things that you're seeing and that are developing with employees who are working remotely and outside the office.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris, and thanks for the intro. So you might ask, what's a tax guy doing on this call, especially during this time? Well, I enjoy pain, so I'm here to sort of relay what could be painful when it comes to remote workers or hybrid employees as it relates to the tax landscape. And as Chris had mentioned in preparation for this, we had several discussions, and it seems as though the trend in quote unquote remote work is sort of shifting somewhat backward. It was, heavy momentum in 20 and 21 to adapt and, make it extremely flexible. And to some extent, there could have been talent issues. Some of our clients were having issues finding people. So a simple solution was, well, let's look outside this geographic area. So with that comes potential landmines, and landmines and tax land are never a good thing. So even though we saw that shift from in-office to remote because of the pandemic, we're still seeing that shift. It's not as fast, and now it's becoming to some extent more of a hybrid. The trends still create tax issues that I've been referring to it almost like a waterfall effect. So simple example, you're a PA-based company. I have many of these, like call it professional services, law firms. They can't find an attorney. They're, posting online. They change it to remote. They start to get several more candidates, hundreds, potentially all of them pretty high caliber. So with that decision becomes a business decision that will impact not only the tax profile of the business, but also the economics. So when you hire an employee that's now working remotely outside of your geographic region, so they don't have a physical location to come into the office, they now have established their own office in a different state. So call it California, Oregon, Colorado. We actually had someone in Illinois. So this is real life. We considered, what were the tax implications of hiring someone in Illinois? So it is a waterfall effect. So you start with hiring someone, now you have payroll registration, that levels into the business now having what's known as income tax nexus in a state. So now a state is going to be looking for a payroll return, an income tax return, and depending on the line of business you're in, there could be sales tax compliance, there could be business tax compliance, there could be a litany of tax administrative issues that a business is going to have to deal with. Now, I'll just say it from a quantitative perspective, a business and those decision makers that are looking to either allow their employees to work remotely or look for remote workers or even hybrid, there has to be an internal policy that allows the business to at least police the process, administer the process, and at least understand what the economics are of making those decisions. The economics being, again, those various tax reportings, additional taxes the business will have to comply with, the additional tax returns. Going back to our Illinois example, we're an accounting firm. This is a bit ironic. We actually consider not filing. We're like, well, we're not going to file Illinois. It's a $10,000 penalty if you don't file. So when we make these decisions, we being our clients and us being the advisors, we lead them in the right direction from a business decision perspective. But I will say that the trend still continues that remote work or hybrid is something that many employees want, and we're going to continue to see that be an option. And to the extent that it's here to stay, businesses need to learn to adapt to this, at least from a tax perspective, understanding what additional requirements and administrative processes they're going to have to go through.
Yeah. So Brian, those are the known issue, like that employee, Illinois, that's the known one. What I've heard a little, and we discussed a little, how about some of the unknowns? Because, there's people who have said, yeah, work wherever you want. And people are taking that to, yeah, hey, I'm going to work for 2 months here and 3 months there. That can create some surprises, right?
Yeah, we call them digital nomads. I think it's actually a term now. But that is an issue. And what we've been advising clients is to create accountability, whether it's a monthly check-in or a quarterly check-in. understanding where you're, and I'll just go back a second, you know, to some extent, and again, speaking from the tax perspective, that was sort of okay during COVID, because many states and localities were pretty generous and flexible with, you know, putting a pause on any of these tax issues. It was sort of like, hey, we know what's going on. We don't have to necessarily create requirements. But most of those pauses have been eliminated, particularly in this geographic region. So if you have people, first of all, if you have someone that's moved and hasn't notified HR, it's probably a more than a tax issue, to be honest, than anything else. But if you do have individuals working, I actually heard, I read the other day that some countries are actually allowing for certain visas for remote workers to encourage remote workers to start working in their countries.
Yeah.
And for a US based company, this is more of Ingrid's territory, but having physical presence in a country, whether it's on a visa that's allowable, does create some significant challenges on the US side. And you'd have to look at the treaty, you'd have to look at what the services are being done in the particular country for the US based company. But you're right. And we've seen those landmines. We're seeing in our firm, we do a lot of transaction work on the due diligence side, where more and more we're seeing the due diligence checklists now asking us where services are being performed by employees, and if you have remote employees, and do you have a policy that requires them to notify you where they're performing the services. So yes, if you don't have an internal process or requirement or anything that requires the employee to be very forthright with where they're operating,
Yeah.
You could be putting the business and the business owners in not just a sort of a tax issue land, but it could be a workers' comp issue. It could be an unemployment tax issue. And if there's a transaction on the horizon, there could be some significant due diligence issues with that being sort of swept under the rug.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. Marcia, do you want to kind of give from your angle of the world some of the things you're seeing?
Yeah, I thought you'd never ask. Absolutely. And Brian, I can relate to that. I actually have recently had a person that said, hey, I'm moving to Alaska, you know, after the fact. And you're like, well, we're not set up in Alaska, and I don't know if we can keep you because of that. And I think that's one of the things that people have to realize. It's not just it's just freedom to everybody out there. I think they have to understand the consequences, but it's really more about educating your employees and saying, hey, it's great, this remote stuff, but what are we doing with it? Where are we going? And how does it affect the company? And we actually had turned down one person because, you know, she wanted to go to a state that the whole idea of filling all those tax forms and all, there's a cost involved with all of that. And there's an annual, sometimes they have an annual return. There's so much more than people think if I just go into another state that it's so simple. It is not. And unfortunately, you want to make sure that you have people attached to your tax people that really know what they're doing, because if not, it could really backfire on you. And so this whole world of work from home is really changing rapidly. I don't know if you guys have seen it out there, but you know, this Friday, a big number comes out, the unemployment number. Last month was 3.6. Miraculously. And so we're going to see where it is this week. And I don't know about you, but we're starting to see a lot more, I call them sort of quiet hiring, which is happening too. I call it quiet layoffs because they don't make a big deal of it out there. But next thing you know, you have 3 friends calling you saying, hey, could you help me with a job? And we're starting to see an explosion in that area. So it's really interesting to see what happens. But what I'm also hearing is, listen, work from home is declining. I do see that some jobs are going hybrid as bosses drag their employees back into work. I would say 2 or 3 days a week. And some people like it, some don't. But when they're in the office and they're like, oh, I really miss hanging out with you. It's great to see you. But when they're home, they're like, it's too cozy, comfy. So you could see it's almost like the weather. The weather's going to be nice. They'll come in, they'll hang out. But as soon as it rains or has that little coating of snow, they're like, oh, it's going to be tough traffic out
Yeah.
there. So it's really has changed a lot out there. But I see work from home right now will stay, but I think it's going to be more of a hybrid approach to it. I think you have to be very careful because your handbooks have to basically state that in there too, what that looks like, what they get, what perks they get, what kind of compensation, what kind of stipends and everything. Everything has to be laid out into those workbooks. And keep in mind, every time they go to a different state, that state sometimes needs its own separate workbook because it has its own different category, like California is its own country. So you have to be very careful when you have these conversations with your team. Not saying that you want to basically say no to them. You just want to make sure that it's, it makes sense for the company and makes sense for them. But I can tell you, I think more people are being asked to come back into the office. So we're in that flux stage right now where I think it's going to be very interesting, where I think eventually we're probably going to get to about 40% of people are going to be in the office, fully remote down to 10. And I would say like that hybrid about 50%.
Marcia, when we're in that flux right now, do you think companies run the risk of treating different people differently and running into like, how do you, especially in this flux, do you think there's sensitivities and possible, whether it's legal, or do you think there's possible challenges to not treating people the same way as?
Yes. Tons of it, because you have to keep in mind, like, I heard the other day that I had a client of mine saying like, you know what, that person won't get promoted. I never see them. And yet that person could be doing the work from home, doing so hard at work, and yet it's an hour to and from. And so is that fair? What's fair, what's not fair? So you're going to have those conversations pop up. So it's really important right now for employers and, directors of HR in particular to really keep that communication open and make sure they're all being listened to and thought. You're always going to have it's like conflict. It's almost like, listen, the manufacturers were upset because they had to go in the office like during COVID and they had to still produce things and all too. And everybody else was basically trying to work from home. You had complications with that as well. I have a lot of friends in construction, and the construction still had to happen. And yet the professional side of the house, they were saying, we're not going in. So it's really has changed a little bit. You have to be very careful about that because of promotions, about employer, even just because you don't see them all the time. Some people still do evaluations upon like how well they know them and how well they trust them, not just always the work. So we have to really train our managers of how to keep things very, simplistic and don't read it too much of it, but make it equal and make it fair for everybody. Very important.
Yeah. And I know in some of our conversations leading up to this, so right now, a lot of time, so far, the discussion has largely been focused sort of on the employer or the organization. But I know you were bringing up, some of the effects of on the employees themselves. And, lots of people want to work from home. I mean, especially like you said, if it's during the winter, when it's colder, that type of thing. But there's lots of people who just say, that's what I want to do all the time. So, and I know you were kind of talking about some of the effects that they might not even realize they're having on themselves.
Yeah, it's a lot of burnout. A lot of people are truly having some burnout issues and all because I don't know about you, but being in front of a screen all day, it's annoying. And we have to get to the point where we have to figure out what works best for us. But we have a lot of introverts who love being at home and they're in their world because they're really good at what they do and they don't like to have all the chitty chatty kind of thing. But we have a lot of people like graduating college seniors. Like you got to understand, they need that camaraderie. They need that kind of training. They need that hand-on training and all too. And they think it's the best thing ever to be remote. I'm like, but you're missing out on so much pivotal training in your life of how to basically achieve your goals, how to get around the relationships, all those pieces. And then when they're in the office, they're like, you can't get rid of them. You're just like, oh my, you can go home now. Like, oh, we're having too much fun. This is so great. But then it's like that first day, you're like, okay, I need you on Thursday. Oh, I can't do Thursday. And you're just like, well, wait, you're having a great time today. And they're like, yeah, today's Tuesday. Then we're all in today, Tuesday. And so I think it's coming down to where people are figuring out what's making it work, because people are not afraid to come back in now. Things have calmed down out there, but the numbers overall for like even remote jobs that are on LinkedIn now has really significantly decreased. Still out there, but has decreased significantly.
Yeah, I know, Brian, in your initial part of this conversation, you were talking about policies, have a policy and that type of thing. And I think we all work in the, small mid-market entrepreneurs. We can say have policies, but a lot of times our clients, whether it's the managers or the owner, they try to avoid really getting written policies because they love being flexible, right? And they themselves almost don't like being cornered into a box by, oh, I've written that policy, I now need to follow it. So I don't know, we talked about that a little bit. And actually, Ingrid, I remember you had a comment that, hey, this can even get into your employee life. If you want to just comment for a second on, lack of policy or having written policies just with employer liability practices, right?
Sure. I mean, everybody thinks about the workers' comp part where somebody gets hurt while they're on the job and they're working from home, and how does that work? But little do they think about the employment practices piece, where if you say for one employee that they can work from home because you know that they're a good worker, that they get the job done and they're not distracted, but then you tell another one who you know wouldn't be able to handle it that they cannot, and you haven't set up the policy, and stuck with it consistently, that's a problem, because you're going to have one employee who was treated unfairly, that they weren't allowed to work from home when the other was, and they're going to sue you. And we have seen a lot of claims come about for that reason, specifically because they feel that they're being unfairly judged based on their non-ability to work from home. So there's a whole different Pandora's box that can be opened from that perspective too.
Yeah, and if, I don't know, Marcia, have you found it challenging to get, you've mentioned some, you need these handbooks and it should be spelling all this out. Have you found challenges in getting people to be willing to put it in writing and kind of have that? Well, one, it's always tough to get them to just go through the work to do it, but have you found resistance to really wanting to spell it out?
Oh, absolutely. Because people don't want to be, I mean, I hate to say it, it's like, it makes it like permanent ink, right? And so people are like, well, we may be able to change this, and we'll do this over here. I'll come in, or I'm even hearing too, like, hey, come in 3 days a week and, make it happen. People might be coming in maybe a day and a half, that's just figuring things out. But what's going to change, I think, too, Chris, is the fact that, like, if unemployment goes up on Friday, and I'm predicting that it will, we actually had less than 10 million. Usually it's a big number for how many job openings are out there, and we actually went under 10 million. And that's the first time since, I guess, beginning of 2001. And so that's a big number. So we anticipate probably some more layoffs happening with all of that coming through. And believe it or not, people don't realize, but if you have remote workers, they actually are 32% more likely to feel anxious about layoffs. And so when that happens, like, you want them to be like well adjusted. You want to make sure that they have, mental health and all too, that they're being home by themselves is also another fear that you have to be careful about, because, it's a very lonely world and they get very anxious when these things are happening. So you want to make sure that when the numbers are out there, that you take care, you're reaching out to them, like, you guys okay, what's happening? But you got to figure out too, like, where you're going to go out the next 6 to 12 months, because all these things are constantly changing right now. And so there's no like consistency to be like, I am here, this is what I'm doing, I know my routine, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. All that is still changing, and that creates a lot of angst. And so I think a lot of people are very reluctant to put too much down into their handbooks right now as permanent because of all the changes.
Yeah. So speaking of how fast things are changing, I just, as we were preparing for this, I was actually just kind of going back through, I like looking at the Wall Street Journal, and to me, it's just, I mean, literally almost a year ago, April 12th, commercial landlords were still worried about, like, oh my gosh, no one is going to be coming back into offices. And here we are a year, to me, a year doesn't seem like that much to be, Brian and Marcia, you guys have already mentioned it, but if you look at headlines, literally just in the last month and a half, big things are coming out in terms of like rushing back the other way. So it really does seem to be going pretty quickly, which leads us to our poll, which, if I'm good at these Zoom controls, I'm going to launch. And it's a very basic poll in terms of what are people planning to do in terms of, going forward. I'll give just a few minutes for this. Interesting that this is sort of matching. I saw some stats come out just last week. I think it was a labor department, and it was actually saying that the numbers, the labor department, I think this was done a few months ago, of businesses that were getting close to pre-pandemic levels of saying that employees telework rarely or not at all. And so literally just a few months ago, the numbers are about 5% short of where they were, and they used to be 20 or 30% short. But one of the things it mentions in that same article is, that's all industries. So you do need to take, that's all industries. You need to take into consideration some of the industries like construction, like Marcia said, or like retail, where they sort of need to be there. It does tamper that report with where people used to or usually work in an office. That is still fairly varied. That hasn't completely rushed back to pre-pandemic levels. So it's interesting. So I'll end the poll. If I did my job correctly, I think I shared the results out there.
Oh,
I'm surprised, actually.
too.
Which surprised where, Marcia?
Predominantly 56%, which I was expecting more of the hybrid, but I honestly think, when times get a little tighter out there and a little rough and the market's a little bit shaky right now, I think people get a little bit anxious and they feel like they're more comfortable going back in the office because they can see what's happening, they can hear what's happening, and they can be around all that. So I'm surprised, but I'm not that surprised.
Yeah, Brian, you
Yeah, just from the, our client base is pretty diverse. And depending on the participants on the call, we are seeing, particularly in the professional service industry, more of a hybrid focus on a future basis. So in office is predominantly, at least, isn't something we've at least seen currently being a heavy trend. It's to Marcia's point, more of a trend towards the hybrid.
Yeah. So as we think about, we've talked about the trends and some of the challenges. I think we've already started talking about how people can best go about them. But Brian, just thoughts. You've mentioned some of the issues that you have, whether it's taxes or due diligence. I know when we were prepping, you were saying there's some best ways that people can approach it, and that you guys are helping people approach these.
Yeah, and again, I sort of, it is a challenge, right? Navigating the tax landscape, and Marcia's fought through it, and she's seen it, she's experienced it, and she's paid for it. So it is complex, it is expensive. But me being, sort of a tax planner, I'm trying to find opportunities as well. So part of our process when we're helping clients navigate, and again, we stay out of the HR land. You can tell them whatever you want, but it has to be clear and concise from a tax rules perspective. So once they're okay on the HR front, then we come in and say, this is what we should be a bit more clear about. This is what we should probably eliminate. And on the opportunity side, I'll just give a simple example. And this wouldn't be a tax discussion without some technical aspect, so I'll get a little technical. But every jurisdiction in the United States, whether it's a state or locality, is going to look to tax a business, whether it's located in the jurisdiction or out of the jurisdiction, depending on whether there's a physical presence there or depending on sourcing of revenue. So as we said, once you have a hybrid or remote person working in a jurisdiction, that's going to create a physical presence. So you sort of know that you're tainted, like you're there, you're on the map, right? Then the waterfall kicks in. But where we've seen opportunities is a lot of jurisdictions are a little conflicting about how they tax you, meaning how are they going to tax, how are they going to source the revenue that they're going to use to then tax the income. It's called sourcing rules. And there's two predominant methodologies. Every taxing authority has this within their regulations. There's what's known as cost of performance or market-based. Market-based is may not be obvious to anyone other than tax or business owners, but market-based is actually looking to where the benefits being derived from the performance. So if I'm working on a client out of Horsham, where our office is, but the client is benefiting because they're in California, so it's a California-based company, California is going to look and say, hey, that's a California source sale because our taxpayers here and they're getting the benefit from your services. So it's that revenue is being sourced to the market where the benefits derived. Okay, so now if I have a person in California, I'm paying income tax on my apportionable share of that revenue, i.e. the net income after you apportion, because that person is there. There are opportunities though, and I'm using a law firm as an example because they seem to be the most flexible, surprisingly, even ones that have to go to court. I don't know how it's working, but Marcia mentioned she's opening or has opened a Florida office. Naturally, they have a lot of attorneys in Florida now. It's unbelievable. They have nice homes. They work out of their homes and on the beach, I guess till the hurricanes come. But they're based out of Philly, and Philadelphia is what's known as a cost of performance jurisdiction. So no matter where your clients sit, they could be in Jamaica, UK, wherever. If all the work's being done out of that Philadelphia office, Philadelphia would tax all those receipts. And they've had that. Their apportionment factor in Philadelphia has been like 100% because they had 100% of the people in Philadelphia. Very expensive. What we've done over the last 2 years is implement a best practice to have every employee, including partners, code their time to when they're working inside the city or outside the city. You might say, well, that seems obvious, but it wasn't obvious to them because they didn't care because they were always working in the city. But now it matters. So we took and a lot of the dollar value work, a lot of the hours, the revenue, when we're sourcing this revenue is derived from some of these high bill hourly rate attorneys that are now working in Florida. So what we've done is we've identified and captured the revenue that the performance is being done on that revenue. The performance is being done in Florida, not in Philadelphia. And there's no income tax in Florida on individuals, which is a partnership, and the partnership passes it out to individuals. So we've effectively taken their Philadelphia apportionment factor from 100% to down to 60. And we've saved this client close to $400,000 over the last 2 years because of this planning.
Wow.
But you can't do it unless you have a policy, you have internal practices, i.e. the coding of the time, and you've coordinated with your external parties like the accountants to make sure they understand the data to then do the tax returns. So look, there's a lot of pain in this process, but I'm sort of a glass half full person, and I'm saying, well, where's the opportunity? And sometimes the opportunities outweigh the costs.
Yeah, interesting. Marcia, as we look at this is changing, and so there are challenges, but some best tips or thoughts about how to keep moving and thriving in this.
Yeah, I think you just got to make sure that you're very clear with communication with your team about, hey, if you're looking to go to a different state, that's great. Just let us know in advance that we can actually do it and afford it, and make sure that they understand what the complications are with that. Number two is making sure, like, having communication with your team of saying, hey, what's working, what's not working, and really just pulling them. I mean, we're big people into self-stay interviews and doing them every 6 months with your employees. And the reason why we do that is to say what's working well, what's not working well, what attributes or what skills are we not using, what's missing, and and being a very honest to not have that person who they report to do that, have somebody else that they don't report to. And I would say just make sure that if you have you got to make sure just listen to the market, listen to what's happening out there. If there's a lot of this stuff going on the marketplace and all too, your at home people are getting super anxious. So you want to make sure that you set some dates to check in with them and what's going on. Do you have a really good EAP program in place? Because it does get a little scary. We're going into a nice area. We're going into May and June. The sun's out. Everybody's happy. That's great. The times that really get worried sometimes is the fall, when things start getting, darker and things getting, people really just sometimes you have hard times. So you want to make sure that you're moving on that. And that has made it harder for HR. HR has had a heck of a time, because now you have these people at home and you have these people in the office, and you're trying to make it all work. But I would say for an HR person, get really tight with your finance person. As hard as that may be, but you have to do it, because all of you have to be on board with each other, because you're all working together to make it work for the company.
Yeah, makes sense. Ingrid, planning to, from a risk management, any tips on how to plan and go forward?
I just wanted to mention a few things that I get asked a lot of times by my clients. One thing we always stress, that when you add an employee in a new state, please let us know, because we need to know that, because the state laws are different for workers' compensation. And if an employee gets hurt in one state, they have that jurisdiction, they can use the benefits of the state that they live in. So instead of that, where the entity is domiciled. So we want to know where they work. Let's say they go out of the country. We've had that happen oftentimes, where they go to Puerto Rico, for example, and that's technically out of the country. What do we do then when somebody gets hurt and they're on the job and we need to pay for their injury because they were technically working at that time? When they go out of the country, there is what's called a duty of care. And we really have to look at the local laws in that country. And some countries have a state social scheme, so we cannot place workers' comp for them. We have to pay in, and that gets into the gray overlapping area that Brian's been talking about, where you need to create an entity so that that entity can then pay into the tax structure within that country, so that they can benefit from the social state scheme. So for Puerto Rico, for example, that is one of those countries that we cannot place the workers' comp direct here. We have to go locally to do it. One of the other things that I get asked often that I think I wanted to just highlight is, well, do I really have any type of liability if my worker is at home? I mean, really, how is he going to get hurt? Do I have to pay for claims? And I say yes. And the degree of proving that the employee was hurt while on the job is going to be on them to prove that they were on the job, and on you to disprove it. So just accept the fact that whatever may happen to them while they're working from home, you're paying workers' compensation to pay for that injury. There are a few things that get looked at with respect to that, whether they're in the course of their work to complete it, whether or not they were working during the times that you tell them they have to work. Is it between 9 and 5? Because oftentimes, if you don't stipulate that, then they can work at 2 o'clock in the morning if they're night owls. It doesn't matter. So whether you stipulate that or not, that's another question if it's documented. But I had a couple of claims examples that I thought might be interesting for those employers on the line who are thinking, like, how could my employee get hurt, or what could they possibly claim against me? There was a woman in Tennessee who was working from home. she was attacked by her neighbor. She put that in as a workers' comp claim, and that particular case came out to be not covered, not compensable. There was a gentleman who was working from home, and he was in his home office when someone came into his home in New York City, imagine that, and they tried to rob the home, and he was shot during the robbery. And he put that in as a workers' comp claim. That was compensable. So he did get covered for his injuries and his time away from work for his pay that he lost while he was recuperating. There was a man in Utah. He worked from home. He walked outside on his driveway on a slippery, snowy driveway to get a FedEx envelope that he claimed was sent by the business, which could easily be proven. And he fell, and that was compensable. And then you have the slew of different claims, which are the most prominent of the claims, believe it or not, where the worker trips over their pet, their dog or their cat, which we hear all the time. And honest to goodness, this varies by state. Each state is different, and whether they say that that is a hazard or not a hazard, they were in the course of their work and they tripped over the dog, so they are compensated for their time away from work and for their injury. Some states let it, some states don't. So it's really the Wild West out there right now when it comes to workers' comp claims and debating whether or not it's covered. I tell all my clients, just imagine that everything that happens to that employee while they're working from home is on you, and that you are having it covered.
Yeah, and I guess if you're going to be tripping on your dog or cat a lot, you might want to throw in some pet insurance if both of you are getting all banged up.
Yeah, for the pet, if they get hurt, if you hurt them while you're tripping over them. But yes, and of course, as we had mentioned earlier, the employment practices piece where you make the rules, and a lot of employers don't want right now to make those rules permanent or concrete because they want flexibility because times keep changing. Exactly what Marcia had said.
Yeah. So as we're coming to the end, so I guess this is sort of a joke. We'll unmute you. You're not technically being unmuted as participants, but we can get into some Q&A. While it always takes people a little bit to get their questions out there, while people are getting their questions. Marcia and Brian, I guess Marcia first. I don't know, just any example, if you just want to talk through any examples of recent things that you're helping clients through on any of the remote worker issues.
It's actually coming down to the big thing is like I said before, of being surprised about somebody just saying, hey, I'm going to be going down to doing work in Minnesota or Florida or wherever, and not having that communication ahead of time, because a lot of companies don't realize there's a lot of pieces on the tax side of the house that have to be taken care of. So it's really helping them with communication around all that, as well as putting some things in the handbook to help them out with that. I'm just saying, hey, if you're an employee looking to basically work out of this for so long, even for like 4 weeks, 6 weeks, or whatever, we need to be told about it as soon as possible to see if we can accommodate that. As well as also, I think stipends are a big deal. I hear a lot more about that right now. And some people give stipends and some people don't, and they just give the equipment instead. Depends on how that's taxable.
So stipends for equipment at home is what you're saying?
Yeah, equipment at home.
Monitors, those types of things.
Yeah, and what does that mean? What does that entail? I'm seeing a lot more of the internet and all too, but that really has to be part of your workbook. And you want to make sure everybody's on the same page, and that consistency has to be there. It's not just because somebody's at home, somebody's here. You have to be very careful about that and how you word it. I think also too is just really the communication about what's expected if you come in the office versus staying at home. And what I've also seen, because now all of a sudden come in the office, they're rolling in at 10 o'clock. And you're like, listen, I realize that, but I still need to get, 8 hours out of you. So we don't really have work hours here. So I have people rolling like that, but I also see people like stay until 8. And I have people will leave here, will say, don't worry, Marsh, I'm going back online. I'm like, what? I'm like, you've been here since 7. Like, you don't need to do that. But they're in that head, that mind space. So really try to put some boundaries around for them as well, because some people will go on and go and go. And some people you have to pull back and just say, listen, I need you to have a life and all too. And I can see it's burning you out. So and others, you got to put a match underneath them. Like, are you working today? So it's really ranges both sides of the house, but be very
Yeah.
careful with that and make sure that you have a lot of communications. We have quarterly town halls with our team, and we go through all these different areas because HR operations is a big part of what we talk about.
Yeah. Brian, you want to add
Yeah.
anything?
So we've been, to some degree, and depending on the client, sort of laying out like a checklist. And I'll read, this is going to make people want to hang up. But when we have clients that are looking to make a permanent decision, this is what we walk them through. This is the administrative burden that Marcia's referenced a number of times. Most of the time you have to register with the Secretary of State. You have to register for business taxes, income taxes, gross receipts taxes, payroll taxes, sales taxes, etc. Payroll, unemployment comp, workers' comp, Wenger had mentioned, state labor laws, sourcing of revenue, like I had mentioned, the market-based sourcing, the cost of performance. You have annual, quarterly, or monthly compliance filings now, whether again, it's income tax, gross receipts tax, payroll tax, sales tax. There's even local requirements, particularly in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. If you have individuals that are in a taxable jurisdiction, you have local income taxes on the earned income. And to some extent, you could have a business privilege tax within a locality. We have an engineering client that hired, they're based out of KOP. They hired a fully remote person in the O&J Roberts School District. So now they've registered for payroll taxes in that jurisdiction because the tax rate was different than that in King of Prussia. They got a correspondence that now that business has to register to file annual business privilege taxes on the revenue that's sourced within the school district. So I'm going to keep going just for a little bit more. Personal property filings. Most jurisdictions in this area have personal property tax filings. So personal property tax, think to Marcia's point, you have personal computers now that could be company-owned property that are now, you have to pay tax on within the state. Maryland has this. It could be a monitor, could be a computer, could be a car, could be a lot of things. Unclaimed property, the worst thing. That's something now you have to be mindful of in every jurisdiction. Then the miscellaneous compliance, you have annual reports. If you're an engineer, you could have professional licensing requirements depending on the profession, business licensing, and a litany of other issues. So we're helping our clients understand the checklist of things to keep them out of trouble. Some of them are better than others. I think my one client swept the O&J Roberts notice under the rug. So we'll see what comes to that.
All right, I have a question in here. Yeah, I think it kind of comes off of what you were. Whose responsibility is it to get an employee's local state taxes correct? The employee or the employer? I think they're talking about like, hey, if I'm an employee and I owe these things at the end of the year, but I've been moving around or I didn't tell you. I think that's what they're getting at is whose responsibility is that?
I see you're recording this, so I'll try to be. You really should be understanding of where your employees are located. Act 32 within Pennsylvania requires each business to pay the higher of rate, whether higher of being where the company is located, where they could be working out of if they're in a hybrid or non-fully remote environment. And compare that to where the employee resides. So if the employee is moving around, it's really going to be on the employer to get that information to properly report the earned income tax, because each jurisdiction could be different. You could be in a jurisdiction that you're working out of that's 1%, where you live might be 1.25, and then where they were traveling or moved to is 0. Right? You don't really know unless they're telling you, but it is, if there was an audit by the locality on the earned income tax, the burden would likely come back to the employer.
Got it. Okay. And another one says regarding mental health. How do we bring it up if we have a concern? How do we approach that as an employer? I mean, I think they're talking about this in how it applies to a remote worker, but I guess that's also just a question in general. So I don't know, Marcia, so they're saying, how do we bring it up if we have a concern? How do we approach it as an employer?
Well, there's a fine line there, right? You want to make sure you do the things, you're not overstepping your boundaries. You might want to bring it to their attention like, hey, have you had to probably talk to the supervisor and find out, like, is it affecting their work, what's happening and all too. There's a question, I don't know about you, I'm a different kind of employer. I'm very blunt. I just ask the question usually and be like, hey, are you okay? Is there anything we need to be aware about? Can we do anything for you if something's going on? Or if their work affects their work and all too, and just saying, hey, we're noticing it affecting your work. Is there something that we are being told of? And you don't want to go in too much boundaries. I think when it gets tricky is when they start telling you they're on something, and then they usually are covered under ADA. So you have to be very cautious about that. I would highly recommend, if you have those conversations, have somebody in the room with you when you do it. And you want to make sure too that you sort of know what you're doing. But I would say it's really just asking the question, like, are you okay? And I noticed basically this has been changing and you haven't been on emails, and I don't ever see your face. And is there something that we could do? And sometimes it comes down to, honestly, nothing's wrong with them. They're just being lazy. But sometimes it's just bringing it to their attention of saying, hey, and I've had some people that had needed EAP in an employee assistance program. I'm not sure if you have that or not, but definitely something to look into if you're an employer. It does help. It's not expensive, but it gives an opportunity for them to reach out to somebody or like a counselor and all too, without having to go through the whole physician piece of it. So just be careful how you do it, but I would say have somebody with you, but I always have somebody that knows what they're doing. If you ever have any questions, just always give us a call. We can walk you through it. But the idea is just making sure that that person is okay, because the last thing you want is something to happen and you knew about it and nothing happened with it.
Gotcha. Cool. Okay. Have another one here. How do your strictest clients manage remote activities, time management, workload, reviews, etc.? So I guess David's specifically asking this: how do your strictest clients manage this stuff?
I'll go on that. I have a few that are strict. And they have it where it can only be in the office kind of a deal. And they made it very adamant that way. And you know what? I'll be honest with you. I have some clients that have had no problem with it because that's the mentality. That's been the culture. Everybody basically helps each other out. I think the hardest part is I do have some other clients that are very upset that some of their employees aren't coming back, but they need that skill. They need that qualification. It's really hard to find that. So instead of basically trying to recruit for it, they're putting up with it, but they're angry about it. So you have to be careful too, because that anger can come out on your employees the wrong way. And so you gotta be really cautious of how you do that. But I think it's really how they're managing it right now is some are really good at communication. Some are really good at having a system for their processes and reviews, and some are not. Some are a mess. And some basically think it's going to just solve itself or have somebody solve it for them, and it doesn't always happen that way. So it's really it's a shame, because a lot of companies are actually going through that, because where do you spend your money on? Do you spend it on new systems, or do you spend your money on more salaries and bonuses to keep your people? And so it's a fine line right now. So I would say you just want to have a flow chart of basically how it's flowing right now from the remote side and from basically the people that are coming in, and making sure that you're all consistent somehow in there. But consistency, again, is key. And you have to be very careful with that, because that's where a lot of lawsuits come from, because that they got that, they didn't have to get that. I didn't get promoted because of this. And finger pointing starts to happen. So if you have everything written out, described, put on a plan, it's to your advantage.
Gotcha. Cool. Thanks. Anyone? I have another question, but did Ingrid, Brian, did you guys want to add to that on the strictest? All right.
I'll just say, I have seen it that, and this may just be a coincidence, but our larger clients that have been very firm in their position, sort of from the get-go, they've had success in having people come back. And larger clients from the manufacturing distribution space, which, to an earlier comment, the labormen are always there, but the professional staff may have been remote. Even those folks are back. And I think the difference between that and smaller, even professional services, they're still wavering. So being strict has actually been a benefit as far as having the messaging being clear versus unclear. And I think, being strict sort of has a negative connotation to some degree, or to at least to some employees, but there's also, at least, right? You don't really,
You're not guessing.
you're not guessing, you know what the mission is. Like, you have to come in. Okay, well, thank you. Now I know. Now it's, this person never comes in, they're not working. So yeah, our larger clients, quote unquote, may be strict, but they've been clear in their messaging.
Gotcha. So Brian, some of your comments right there lead into the next question. The question is, are you seeing trends by industry of those companies increasing their requirements to work in the office more frequently?
Well, what I will tell you is, our software companies, technology companies, professional service companies, I don't necessarily see a huge trend to 100% back. So those, and to some extent, even engineers, we are seeing our clients begin to adapt and comply with the various intricate details of compliance, even going to the length of the HR issues and the tax issues. That's where we're seeing our companies finally being, within the last year and a half, really make the decision to say, hey, we're doing this, we're going to do it the right way, and we're going to make this part of our internal process and practice.
So sorry to pop that up. It was, I just seen this earlier. So this goes a little bit to, I think, what the person was asking, just in terms of the share of private sector establishments with some or all employees working remotely. And you nailed it right there, Brian.
Yeah.
With the lead information, I think down below, it says that's described as tech and media and that type of thing.
Yeah, I have a software client, pretty large software client out in Lancaster. And before COVID, everyone was in like every day and everyone enjoyed it. Now he's, now he has to like get lunch and like, have a party or something to get their people to come in, hire clowns, something. Like it's a struggle. So, he's a little interesting. He's actually saying, you know what? You don't want to come back, fine. He's actually carving up his office space and making it a venue. So he has a nonprofit operating out of it now. He's having an event, one of his sections carved out to have like weddings and corporate events. Maybe we'll have one of his own corporate events at his own venue, so, but yeah, I guess whatever you pulled up from the Wall Street Journal, we're just a middle market accounting firm, but that is what we're seeing.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's all we have in the Q&A. I'm sorry, Ingrid, did you have, were anything you wanted to add there?
No, I agree 100% with Brian. With the clients that we have on staff here, our book of business, those that are in the professional realm, the technology, they really grabbed hold very tightly of the remote work environment and let go of a ton of office space, which freed up money that they were paying not only in rent, but also in insurance on that property space. And they want their people to work from home. They do every week town hall meetings in order to keep right on top of what the workload is and review the performance of everybody to make sure everybody's on the same page. All the things that Marcia had said ties up into that meeting on a weekly basis so that they can keep a pulse on their people at home. The manufacturers out there, those people that are in the service industry, we see that they have continued to be in the office atmosphere at the factories. They're there and they're not going to go anywhere. So it's very delineated because you really see the professional white collar wants to be remote. They're going to stay that way. The manufacturing, the hands-on, where you need to be there in person, that's going to be there. One thing in the insurance industry itself, we meet with so many different insurance company carriers and underwriters, and they all tell us when they come out here, we're a hybrid. KMRD is very flexible with respect to letting employees either work from home or not. A lot of us choose to be here because of the camaraderie and the social aspect of being able to collaborate together. When we meet with the carriers in person, they're all telling us the higher up executives, that the C-suites, they want everybody in the office. They want them back 100%. And they're having a really difficult time getting the pulling the employees back. So they're doing it a little bit at a time. You know, they're doing 2 days a week. You have to be in the office, and then 3 days they can be from home. But they said their ultimate goal in the next year, they want everybody back in the office. They just feel that they can build the culture much better, regardless of whether the job can be done at home. They have the pulse on the culture better when they have the employees there under their nose, so to speak.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
Mhm.
Well, we're coming up on the hour, so really appreciate it. Thanks for everyone's questions. And especially thanks, Marcia, Brian, Ingrid, thank you so much. I think some people coming up this weekend may have a long weekend. As we were talking among us, Brian has a different kind of long weekend, and accountants will have a different kind of long weekend. Some of us may have more of a long weekend with some time off. So really appreciate everybody's time, and have a good rest of the week.
Thank you all for joining.
Bye.
Bye, guys.